So, I checked the calendar like I said I would, and our spring break is the week of March 10th. Um, I realized that your guys' spring break is probably in April. Um, Although looking at when spring break usually falls, typically it's around Easter, and Easter falls really late this year. Um, our semester is going to basically be over by the time Easter hits. So, um, last name? Phillips. Gotcha. Um, so we're going to have spring break when Francis Marion does spring break, because I'm going to need a break by the time we get to mid March. Come on in. Um, Last name? Dowdy. You're good. Yeah. So spring break is going to be the week of March 10th for us, um, which means that the paper will be the week before. So it'll be that Wednesday, which is March 6th. Um, so the paper topics on the syllabus. It's the said Civil War. I'm getting my classes mixed up. Did the um, French Revolution end with Napoleon? That's the default topic. There's a whole lot more you can do than just that if you want to. We've got like a month and a half before we get there, so there's plenty of other stuff you can do. Plenty of other things to think about. Plenty of time before you have to worry about it. It's 2.5 pages, double space. It's not that big a deal. But I figured I'd go ahead and talk to you guys about that now rather than later, because I might forget about it. So yeah, just FYI, you've got like a month and a half before you need to worry about the first paper. So just FYI, I figured I'd go ahead and get to that before I completely forget about it, and it'd be like mid February before I remember that I haven't talked about it yet. So it's like the second week of March will be when that's due. Or first week of March, first full week of March. Yeah, because March starts on like a Saturday. It's weird. Okay. Any questions before we start our actual first chapter, which is technically chapter 14? But the yes. Maybe it's out of print, which sucks, and I apologize for that. I've not had the time or the brain power to swap books yet. I'm going to try to do that for next year. If you might be able to get your hands on a digital copy. If not, it'll all be up here. So don't stress about it. Yeah, this class specifically, don't stress too much about the book. But if you can get your hands on like a digital copy, I think I might have run across it on like an old archive site. There are like digital archive for textbooks in places. Yeah, don't like spend a lot of money on it, especially now that it's out of print. Which is like, why would you out of print a textbook? I think so. I'll look more into it. Yeah, I'm gonna have to find another textbook. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, there should be, but I'm not entirely sure where. But yeah, if you can't find it, don't stress. Yeah, and again, on like the syllabus and stuff, when I say, hey, go to this page about the thing, don't worry about that. That's back when I was teaching upstate, and everybody like was supplied a book. So don't worry about that. Anything else? Okay, so we are going to start right smack dab in the middle of a lot of stuff happening. Um, and I don't know how much you guys know about European history, but we are in the middle of a lot of stuff happening in European history. So, there's a lot going on. Now, this is just kind of an overview of the chapter. We're going to talk about each of these in turn. But you've got the 30 Years' War, which is this huge, basically was the last big war of religion in Europe. It was so bad that Europe kind of in general decided they were going to stop fighting wars of religion. This was the last big, like, Catholic versus Protestant war. Spain was bringing in so much silver from the New World that they crashed the economy. I kind of briefly talked about that last semester when I was going over the last couple of chapters. And it made it so that peasants couldn't afford food. Also, there was a huge famine across the continent that starved a whole lot of the population, in particular France, because there was a big population boom. And due to the population boom, when there was a famine, it killed a lot of those people. Also, the Black Death wasn't done. The Black Death wasn't a single event in the 1500s that happened and that went away. It was still around. It occurred every like 10 to 30 years. And like once you got it and survived, you were pretty much immune because it's a bacterial infection. But your kids wouldn't be because you couldn't pass on that immunity. So every time it showed up, it killed a lot of people. And especially after a famine, it killed a whole lot of people. So especially in this time period, it was real bad. So let's talk about the 17th century, which is the 1600s, by the way. So, in this time period, or before this time period, kings were just the strongest in a group of nobles. They weren't this like divine right monarch that ruled over everybody without question, like we're about to talk about. Now, in theory, a king's lineage was divine right. It was, ordained by God and all that good stuff. However, if a lineage died out, which it often did, because oftentimes the king's lineage would be very inbred, or oftentimes has happened in, I think it was Spain. The king died in like a jousting accident, just like they were goofing around and they were jousting, and he died and didn't have an heir. So they just like elected another noble to become the next king. Because that was just what it was. It was just a noble that was in charge. Still though, the king couldn't just do whatever he wanted. He had to take the counsel of the nobility, because the nobles provided the king with armies and money with which the king ruled. The nobility was, I guess, the closest example I could use. If the president were king, the nobility would be like, Congress. You can't rule without some level of representation. And while nobility certainly wasn't representation for the regular people, they still kept the king somewhat honest. Now, as we're going to see with the 30 Years' War, many kings wanted to reduce the power of the nobility because, well, the nobility had their own armies, and the king wanted to have like a standing army. That wasn't a thing before this point, where we have like today, we have an army all the time. And at any time, you can just snap your fingers and say, hey, get the army together and go, invade a country. And the armies were beholden to the nobles, who told the armies to go follow the king, whereas the king here wanted the armies to follow the king. Also, the kings worked to control the church. Again, those of you that were here last semester recall how much back and forth there was between the king and the church and the pope and yada, yada, yada. There's a lot of power in the church. And by power, I mean they own a lot of land, and land makes money. So let's talk about the 30 Years' War. Now, we discussed the Protestant Netherlands quite a bit. This led to William of Orange and all of that. Spain tried to destroy the Protestant Netherlands, while the Austrian Habsburgs, who were also the same royal line as the Spanish nobility, dealing with the Protestants in everywhere. Austria was in charge of the Holy Roman Empire, which was basically all of Central Europe. And the Protestant Reformation happened in all of Central Europe. So it's just happening everywhere all at the same time. And so Spain wasn't dealing with a whole lot of Protestant Reformation. They were focusing on the Netherlands, while Austria is just tearing itself apart from the inside. So the Habsburg emperors were making Catholic landowners into nobles to make more, Catholic nobility, so that they could outnumber the Protestants, but only made it so that there were, more Catholics and more Protestant nobility, so there was more pressure. The Catholics saw the Protestants as heretics. The Protestants saw the Pope as the Antichrist. There was no kind of compromise to be had. There was no let's sit down and decide what we disagree on and what we agree on, because they agreed on a lot. I mean, if you know anything about Protestant and Catholic doctrine, there's a lot different, but it's not worth killing each other over, although they did a lot of that back then. Who knows what defenestration means? Yes. Correct. I had a student, it was last year or the year before, I got to this slide, and she nearly jumped out of her chair. She's like, "Ooh, I know what that means." I was like, "Tell me what that means if you're so excited." She apparently had seen, there was a video she had seen on it, all about defenestration. And she sent it to me after class. It was very amusing. So it's a fun word to know. So we're going to talk about the defenestration of Prague. So the nobles in Bohemia were growing restless as they had to swear allegiance to their Prince Ferdinand, who was a Catholic. Because prior to this, there had been wars of religion already. And the ruling had been whatever the religion of the ruler is the religion of the land. So, the King of England is Protestant, so England is Protestant. Even if you're Catholic, you have to swear allegiance to your Protestant king, whatever. Which is why when there was, James, who was Catholic, that was a whole concern, but we'll deal with that later. I think, actually, that was last semester. It doesn't matter. So, Ferdinand, being Catholic, made the Protestant nobles unhappy, but they had to do what they had to do. However, Ferdinand preferred spending time in Vienna and left Bohemia in charge of his Catholic hardliner regents, which meant that the Protestant nobility not only weren't dealing with the actual prince, but also were getting mistreated by said regents. So they finally stormed the royal palace, and threw 2 of these regents out of a 2-story window. Hence defenestration. However, neither of them died due to a surprisingly and conveniently placed pile of horse excrement. However, this would spark one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history. Well, I say the bloodiest. It was the bloodiest conflict up to this point in European history. And I think really up until like World War I, even the Napoleonic Wars weren't this bad. So I have an image of these guys getting chucked out the window. I don't have the landing though. Sorry. So very quickly, the Protestants knew that the Holy Roman Empire was going to move on them, and they needed to rally and be ready for the worst. So they rallied under Frederick V, conscripted an army, gained the support of the Austrian and Hungarian Protestants, besieged Vienna. However, a siege is nearly as hard on the besiegers as those being besieged. The siege broke due to disease and lack of food. They were not ready. They were not prepared for the siege that they themselves were preparing. So Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand, I'm sorry, I was going to say that's another Frederick. Ferdinand II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, which is to say the guy in charge of the Catholics, bribed Austrians, got the support of the Poles, Bavarians, and Spanish, decimated the Protestants at the White Mountain, routed them to Prague, and this was seen as poor taste back then. Put the stragglers to the sword. 12 heads, 2 hands, and a tongue were put on display at the Prague main gates for over a decade. I feel like the tongue probably got grabbed by a crow pretty early on. This was known as the Blood Court and was used as propaganda against Catholics throughout most of the war. And there's a lot of this. A lot of brutality on both sides, I should say. But the Catholics tended to be tended to have the upper hand in most of this war, so they tended to be doing most of the atrocities. In 1621, Ferdinand II ordered all Calvinists out of Bohemia, which was about 20% of the population. That's not easy to do. That's 1 in 5 people. Is just, hey, leave the country. That's a lot of people. So, after Prague, Spain went back to picking on the Dutch. Denmark joined in the war, not wanting Protestantism to be wiped out in mainland Europe, due in part to, Scandinavia had basically immediately gone Protestant as soon as the Protestant Reformation happened. They're largely pagan now, but their largest single denomination is still Lutheran, because they were not under the control of the Holy Roman Empire at all. But if they had like a solid Holy Roman Empire to the south of them, they would have to contend with a potential invasion. So if they had the fractured Holy Roman Empire to the south, that would be safer for them. So that's why they joined into the war. At the same time, or at least a little bit later, 1625, England under Charles I bankrolled the Protestant cause and also sent in some troops. That's something that England does a lot. We'll send money and also some troops. They did the same in World War I for a while. It's like, oh, we'll send in like an expeditionary force. Like, thanks, England. You're like 2,500 guys will help out a whole lot in this 500,000 guy war. The Catholic general Albrecht von Wallenstein rebuilt the army to 110,000 troops, mostly mercenaries and conscripts. They were not exactly paid well and were expected to live off the land, which is to say, take what they needed from enemy towns, which is to say, looting and pillaging, which meant that civilians bore the brunt of the depravity of this war. In May of 1631, the Protestant stronghold of Magdeburg fell. The city was burned down, and the soldiers killed 20,000 civilians, leaving only 425 survivors. The book mentions, let's see, Yeah, their bodies had to be thrown in the river, as the remaining 450 inhabitants of the town had neither the strength nor space to bury them. Nor did they have sufficient wealth to rebuild the town, much of which was still rubble nearly 100 years later. The atrocities led the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus, who, bankrolled by the Catholic French king, joined the war on the side of the Protestants and turned the tide of conflict at the most dire hour. Now, normally that'd be the only mention of Gustavus Adolphus, but I went back and put an entire slide in for him because he gets his own like page in the book, so I had to include him. He's pretty cool. I'm going to get back to that in just a second. So here's Magdeburg being burned down while the troops swarm in to just like butcher civilians. Now, before we do get to Gustavus, why were the French helping the Protestants if the French were Catholic? Well, England was helping the Protestants too. Think about the geography. The main Catholic forces are Spain and Austria. Where's France? And by Austria, I mean like Central Europe. Right. So, how should I put this? Does France benefit from a strong or weak Holy Roman Empire? Which is to say, where Germany is today. Do they want strong or weak neighbors? Right. Even though they're on the same side religiously, France is looking at this from a political point of view. And also, I should mention, we talked about this a couple of slides ago, Spain and the Holy Roman Empire are not only both Catholic, they're the same crown. If Spain and the Holy Roman Empire completely wipe out Protestantism not only will they not have internal issues anymore, they're just going to, I mean, they might not wipe out France, but they're going to put pressure on France. So it's to France's benefit that they're dealing with the Protestants. So France is looking at this from a political point of view, which is why they're getting involved. Even though later they like kick out all the Huguenots, which is just the French Protestants. But anyway, yeah, that's why that's going on. It's not just which is what we see in like nearly every war. It's not just this side versus this side. There's a lot of stuff going on. So, Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North. He was quite the interesting individual. He used propaganda, such as Magdeburg, as well as his own charisma. Won over many German princes who had been neutral in all of this, because a lot of Protestant princes didn't want to get involved because they felt like if they joined in, they'd be on the losing side, but Gustavus came in and, well, won them over to work with him. Also, I think he had, the Dutch were working with him as well. The Dutch were like cutting edge technology at the time. They had like brass cannons. So he used that, despite being from, Sweden. Let's see. Powerful army of musketeers and cannons outmaneuvered enemy armies. Musketeers fired in volleys, so, the group in the front would fire, move to the back, the next group would fire, move to the back. So by the time everybody got done firing, by the time the guys at the back were now in the front again, they had gotten done reloading and they were ready to fire again. So there was a constant stream of musket fire, rather than if you've been to like a Civil War reenactment, they fire and then there's like 5 minutes of just reloading. And then the cannons were lightweight, so you could pull them up on a hill, fire down, and then move them to another hill, and basically have a really ridiculous amount of mobility for a 16th century battlefield, or 17th century battlefield. For example, at the Battle of Breitenfeld, Swedish army defeated the Imperial army of 37,000 men, killing about 7,000. Enemy commander was wounded. The army was reduced to 13,000 after they fled in disarray. So despite killing about 7,000, about half just broke and ran and didn't return to the army. Set up a series of bases, pulled together German forces. He was killed at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. Now, while the battle was won, their momentum was broken with the loss of Gustavus Adolphus. And, come to find out, Sweden has like a Gustavus Adolphus Day. There's like a holiday after this guy. So, yeah, he's well remembered. So here he is. This is a picture that's in the book. He was a flashy fella. And also, while I was looking at pictures of him, this came up. This is in Minnesota, I think. There's a lot of Swedish immigrants that ended up in the upper Midwest. And, well, there you go. They've got a Gustavus Adolphus College. They love the guy. And based on my limited research, I like him too. There's even a Sabaton song for Gustavus Adolphus. If you're not familiar with Sabaton, they're a metal band from Germany, I think. A lot of their songs are based on like historical events and historical characters. And there's one on Gustavus Adolphus, so yeah. It's a thing. There's also one for Napoleon, because of course there is. All right. So despite his victories, by 1635, the Holy Roman Empire was again on top of things. As I mentioned, Adolphus had died in 1632. However, the imperial leader, who was sort of Adolphus's like foil, had also died after being accused of treason and then murdered. I don't know what the difference is in like murder and assassination in these cases, because I feel like if you're like a top general, you being killed will be considered, I don't know. So as I mentioned, France didn't want to be hemmed in by the Spanish and Austrians, who were both Habsburgs, which is to say they're of the same crown. So France officially joined the conflict under Louis XIII. So now France is officially in the war rather than just spending money on the war. And this is when the war got especially bad, because France has a big army, and they're sending in a lot of guys. And this is when, I mean, not that the war didn't already have a lot of atrocities, but this is when it's most well known for the atrocities. Armies full of mercenaries and cutthroats, pillaging, looting villages and towns. They invented new forms of torture to get victims to tell them where they had hidden their money before they died. So like they would find ways to torture them as slowly as possible so that they wouldn't die too quickly. Yeah, it was a really, really bad time, I would say, to like be a villager, but like to exist in Europe. Things were so bad that there were multiple spin-off civil wars all over Europe. In France, Spain, the British Isles. I mean, there were obviously, like, not just England, but obviously in Ireland. Ireland, anytime, like, something happens, something falls over in England, and the Irish are like, we should rise up now. So, yeah, obviously Ireland tried to break away again. Peace, at least in terms of the 30 Years' War, was reached with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. So the 30 Years' War at least ended here. Everybody else was involved in their own wars at the time now. So yeah, this was a real bad time in Europe. Just to once again kind of get into that. The book has a picture similar to this, but the picture that I found is, how should I say this? The picture in the book doesn't have as big of a tree. The mercenaries would like come into town, just grab people at random, hang them from a tree, and then tell the other people in the village, "Hey, we'll do this to you too if you don't tell us where your stuff is." Like they wouldn't even make demands before they started hanging people. And I'm pretty sure I mentioned this to you guys last semester. There's two ways to hang people. With the gallows, you know, the bottom drops out and it drops and breaks your neck, which is the good way to do it because it kills you instantly. And then there's this way where you slowly are strangled to death. Yeah. So, not great. Oh, right. I feel like this one might have been what was going on in Ireland. Some had their infants cut out of their wombs and thrown to dogs and swine. Some were set in the ground up to their chin and starved to death. Yeah, people were just like some of the worst stuff people were doing to each other. This was an extremely bad war. And this was just Protestants and Catholics. Just cause. Like, there was nothing, no real land changed hands. Like, they weren't fighting over, like, precious stones or wealth or, like, ancestral lands. It was over, like, should we listen to the Pope or not? Now there was major religious and political ramifications. Now, as I said before, during previous wars of religion, because, like I said, there have been several, the prince could choose the religion for the state, and whatever he chose was now the official religion of the state. However, other religions were more or less tolerated. So, if the king was Protestant and there were Catholics in the nation, then they could be Catholics without being, like, burned at the stake. Also, Calvinism was now recognized, which is weird because Calvinism was, like, one of the biggest forms of Protestantism, although it wasn't recognized, like, at all until this point. That's why there was such a massive influx of Puritans into North America at this time, because Calvinists weren't seen as, like, legitimate. Spain was pretty much destroyed at this point. I mean, they had essentially been destroyed since the Spanish Armada, which was how we essentially ended last semester. But now, after this, they were financially bankrupt. Most of its army was killed or depleted. And the 30 Years' War proved, finally, religious conformity by force was not possible. And, yeah, as I mentioned, religions other than the one favored by the prince were allowed, even if they were often somewhat restricted. It's something that takes, like, until nearly, I want to say, like, the mid-1800s until the Catholics can hold, like, even civil service jobs in Ireland, because the English are, well, English. And that's, like, 50 years before the Irish even just, like, fully are independent. But this didn't apply to everybody. Once again, Louis XIV completely outlawed Protestantism. In 1685, witch hunts, abuses of Muslims and Jews remained commonplace because, who cares about the 30 Years' War we just had? We're just going to do whatever the hell we want. Whoa! What the hell happened? I think my keyboard might have died. Oh well. Now, you 100% don't need to know this map. I'm just showing you this because there's just a lot of everything everywhere. Although it does show, yeah, where Gustavus went, the red line, all the way down here, and all the way down there, and then up here. Now there was a little bit of land changeover, but, like, all of this is where the war happened, and then there's just, like, these little tiny little bits of, like, oh, this guy got land and some land over here and over there. But yeah, here we go. This one's specifically in Russian because it's just this is 30 years of people moving around and just, like, killing each other all over the middle of Europe. It's just a complete mess, which is the 30 Years' War. All right. I think they did die. Bug Brent for some batteries. Yeah, it's dead. Cool. All right. All right. So, I also briefly talked about the Baroque period last semester, but we weren't able to get into it to any great detail. So, the Baroque culture is part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which is to say it's the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. So it's it's an art form that's extremely emotional, very lavish. It's part of it includes a lot of divine suffering, particularly in response to or in regards to the martyr saints. The culture did shift in regards to European absolutism. From Rome to the north, with the Habsburg empires of Spain and Austria, and then into France after the 30 Years' War, which is similar to how we saw the Renaissance, where it starts in Rome and it gradually makes its way up through northern and then into Western Europe. It's just how it seems to be how the artistic movements go. Which, I mean, you got to follow the money. Artists got to get paid too. Starving artist just as in a saying. I spent enough time with artists. Okay. We got a lot of blocks of text here. Don't worry too much about it. So Shakespeare was around during this time. Maybe, probably. I'm not going to be one of those like conspiracy people that's like, Shakespeare didn't really exist. I'm going to say he probably did. Or there were multiple people who wrote things and they all worked under the shared name Shakespeare. I don't know. I'm going to say Shakespeare existed. And the reason we remember Shakespeare is that he changed what his plays were about. Most plays up to this point were about like classical literatures, like Greek and Roman stuff, or about like biblical plays. Shakespeare's topics were typically historical, so like the War of the Roses, typically like English-centric stuff. So his audiences were very keen on listening to that. Obviously, the British were dealing with issues facing the people who were right there listening to his plays. For example, would there be a peaceful royal succession? Would the new leader be as competent as the current one? And considering Elizabeth I was right there in his audience very often, and he liked to kiss up to royalty because Elizabeth I was a very good patron, he would delve into social issues, treatment of women, political ramifications for common people. He did stuff other than, let's just retell stuff that's been retold for the last, 500 years. So it's not just that, Shakespeare was a visionary. It's like, he actually did something different. It was Shakespeare's big thing. I'm not going to pretend reading Shakespeare's plays is, all right, I mean, reading Shakespeare's plays now is like reading classical literature back then. It's like, it's been done literally 500 years now. It's getting a little bit old. But at the time, it was like brand new and stuff that hadn't been done. So, yeah, it's cool and important historically. But in a literature class, it's a little bit dry. Why isn't it? Okay. Miguel de Cervantes? Don Quixote, would-be conquistador living in his own little world, which reflected the self-importance of the declining Spanish nobility. This is the guy that would tilt at windmills. This is the conquistador who thought that the windmills were giants, and he would try to joust them, and then would get brain damage. Which was representing the Spanish nobility, who thought they were all still really important, even though Spain was like not in the slightest bit. In fact, once we get to Napoleon and post-Napoleon, we're gonna talk about like the great powers in Europe, and Spain isn't one of them. In fact, a little German state that hadn't been anything up to this point is going to be considered a great power. And Spain is just completely ignored because Spain isn't anything anymore. Dang it. Grimmelhausen. Adventures of Simplicissimus. Yeah, why not? Peasant forced to join the 30 Years' War. It's a tale of pointless cruelty. I guess that's supposed to be Satan. Let's see. The book gives a little bit more detail on it. That's actually not something I've read. By German writer H.J.C. von Grimmelhausen. The career of another sort of simpleton, not a nobleman like Don Quixote, ordinary peasant. First pages, his farm is overrun by marauding soldiers who rape and kill his mother and sister. The peasant survives by hiding with the hermit in a forest until he is nearly murdered by another group of soldiers and forced to join the army. He learns what it is to be a mercenary, to be a merciless thief and an unprincipled man who works for whoever pays best, and learns that there is no justice and perhaps no rhyme or reason in this world. So it's basically a response to the 30 Years' War. Everything's terrible. Everything's terrible and nothing makes sense. And then John Milton's Paradise Lost. Retelling of Satan and Adam's fall, giving a new perspective on the cruelty of God's judgment and the horrors that he let befall the world. The book, actually let me read here. Reflected the moral anguish and experienced by many of his contemporaries. Satan, the fallen angel, denounces God for rejecting him and for allowing terrible evils to torment humankind. Adam accepts his expulsion from Eden. The inevitable toil and suffering he will now be humankind's lot. Demonstrates the extent which Milton and his contemporaries worried about God's responsibility for the evil and hardships experienced by his earthly children. Readers of the poem often came away convinced not of God's ultimate justice, as Milton wished for them to, but resentful of God's cruelty towards both of his creatures, Satan and Adam. Milton was a Puritan. Milton was like, oh yeah, punish me, Daddy God. I love being in trouble, because Puritans really liked the idea of fire and brimstone God, and the idea of God being really, really angry and punishing us for no reason was a good thing. While like everybody else was like, wow, God's kind of a dick. And that's also where we get sexy Satan from, by the way. Like the illustrators were like, oh no, Satan's like trying to do his best. And everybody's like, man, Satan maybe wasn't a bad guy. And Milton's like, no, what are you doing? Yeah. Good old John Milton. Paradise Lost was an interesting book. All right, so on to art. The art, of course, continued the trend of Baroque architecture, eye-catching, massive scale, typically religious nature, though of course with monarchs, mostly portraits. Although a lot of artists took commoners as their subjects, showing that the common man was just as important and worth contemplation, which, interesting. Which this was a time of humanism. We're post Enlightenment. We're getting towards the Enlightenment. We'll talk about the Enlightenment. I want to say real soon. Or we might have already taught it. Oh yeah, Enlightenment. Yeah, Enlightenment's coming up. All right. So we have Catholic painters like Rubens use bright colors, while Protestant painters like Rembrandt, who is one of my favorites, um, use light and dark. So Catholics like this use a lot of bright colors. You of course have Jesus being put up on the cross. You've got lots of colors. This is a like a trifold piece where they could just like set it up. And even you got the eclipse about to happen over here. There's a lot going on in this. And then the problem with a Rembrandt piece is it's hard to see on a screen unless you've got the lights off. This is The Night Watch by Rembrandt. This is actually a piece specifically for his little town in the Netherlands. I think it might actually be Amsterdam specifically. It's the Night Watch. It's the city watch there in the town, and they've got the armor that's shining in the light, while there's the guys in the back in the shadow. Meanwhile, we have Jan Vermeer, who was a Dutch painter. He also used ordinary people and scenes. Girl reading a letter by an open window. Jan Steen, who was also Dutch. Broken families and dissolute households. Here we have girl reading a letter by an open window. You can tell by the name. Also, I mean, just besides how the fabric looks, like you can see her reflection in the pane of glass, but the reflection isn't perfect. It's broken by the various panes of glass, and it's warped because the glass, especially back then, wasn't perfect. It would actually run and like it'd be thicker at the bottom and thinner at the top because the glass actually isn't a solid. It's a really amazing piece to be a painting. And then the dissolute household here. There's a lot happening. So they left the turkey on the floor and the dog's having at it. Somebody's stealing grandma's money because she's passed out at the table drunk. They've got a monkey up here for some reason. I don't know. I mean, I guess people back then would have capuchin monkeys running around the house. There's cards on the floor, which represents gambling problems. Yeah, there's a lot happening. Music. I mean, we've always had music. I put this in here myself. We've had music since humans figured out how to bang sticks together. But the Baroque period was an especially big expansion in music. Most compositions were tied to the church, although many royal patrons had musicians making chamber music. Whoops, I keep forgetting my keyboard's dead. Johann Bach, famous for his organ music. Of course, when it comes to innovation, it's Italy. We're going to see that again later on this semester. Claudio Monteverdi, 1607, composed the first opera Orpheus. Antonio Vivaldi developed harmony and counterpoint, laid the groundwork for polyphonic music, which is to say, music that uses different rhythms and beats together to create a harmonious sound, rather than if you've ever heard trying to think of an example. I don't know, Gregorian chanting, where it's just a single sound. This would be more modern music. How every time there's a new type of music as far back as I can remember. It's the devil's music until another type of music comes out, and then now that's the devil's music because it uses different types of sound, and that's going to make you, I don't know, go to hell or whatever. Because the church is scared of music for some reason. I don't know. Oops, I keep forgetting it. Political ideals also began moving away from the idea of divine kingship, focusing on how a state should be run more efficiently. Instead of, hey, there's this guy that's really inbred and can't walk on his own, but we should totally let him run the country. Now, these were dangerous where absolutism was seen as, the norm, which is to say, like, especially Russia. So most of this was in the Netherlands or England, because while England did still have a king, if you guys recall from last semester, those of you that were here, we had a constitutional monarchy in England, which means that while there is still a monarchy, it's equal to Parliament. So they don't rule on their own. Parliament's equal with them. And the Netherlands especially is basically a republic. So this idea of let's run the state efficiently is good for the Netherlands and England. As far as France and Russia, not so much. So, these ideas include natural laws, pushed by a Dutch humanist like Hugo Grotius. This goes all the way back to Cicero. Basically, this should stand above human law, which is to say the power of the king, preserve safety and not coerce people with religion. This will become human rights and international law. So we should do what's good for people and not, be coerced by what's seen as good because a king says so. Now, granted, there were more aggressive pushes for weakening of sovereignty. For example, in England, there was the English Civil War, which I think we talked about last semester with Cromwell. John Hobbes and Leviathan argued that a social contract was necessary for order. And we'd actually talk about John Hobbes in my American history class because we use the social contract in our argument for we'll talk about the English Civil War in a little bit later because that comes up not long before the American War for Independence. So, yeah. And if you're familiar with who Hobbes is. Anyway, yeah, there's John Hobbes. He also said that the life of the, lives of the Commodores were nasty, brutish, and short. And I didn't realize until I got to this that the little goblin critters in Fable that were called Hobbes and they were described as nasty, brutish, and short. I didn't realize they were actually a reference to this guy. So, yeah, a game I played like 20 years ago. Anyway, yeah, the Commodores didn't have a long life, and the near certainty of an early death kept them pretty close adherence to the to religion. However, an increased literacy rate meant that propaganda could now be easily spread through the populace. So, as I had shown you guys with the Reformation, you don't have to be literate to have propaganda. You can just use images, as we had with that lovely little dog. But with people being able to read, you can get more done with propaganda. Also, while Protestants and Catholics certainly didn't agree on things, one thing they did agree on was that Satan was scary and so was witchcraft. Between 1550 and 1750, about 50,000 people were executed in Europe and the Americas for witchcraft. Now, I don't know why the Americas are included there, because we only executed like a few dozen, I think, total. Well, no, that's not true. It says the Americas, so I don't know what was going on in South America. They were heavily Catholic, and the Catholics liked burning people at the stake, so I don't know what happened in South America. So if we couldn't explain natural disasters, or just needed somebody to blame, it was a witch, probably. Gradually, as states became more powerful, and people overall became more prosperous, and there was no longer like a need to, blame your neighbor for your crops failing. This gradually was put to an end. I have it in here in the book. Yep. Katarina Schmidt died in 1746 in Poland. In Poland, the last witch was executed as late as 1776. So it took a while. So there is an image of some witches hanging out with Satan, I guess, and some weird bird crocodile things. I don't know, I feel like this one over here came to the wrong meeting. This one also has my favorite image, though. This old lady, like, feeding her frogs and what looks like a possum gremlin thing. It kind of reminds me of my weird old neighbor that just, like, randomly lets cats in her house. Granted, I've just been finding cats and been taking care of them, but she just like, this cat just came in my house, and I was like, okay. You mean the fully grown tomcat that you've not taken to the vet? Yeah, all right. And I feed him scraps. It's like, okay. And this was typically how they dealt with the witches, by burning them alive. Let me see here. Let's at least talk about France. We still got 10 minutes, and I want to go ahead and get started. So, Louis XIII would not call the States General, which was the representative body within France. After 1613, and his son, Louis XIV would also not call the States General at all. However, they could not be rid of the parliaments, which were just local courts, that would continue to voice objections with how the king would be doing things, but obviously local law courts couldn't do a whole lot. The 30 Years' War didn't do a whole lot for France in terms of gain. Obviously, nobody really won a whole lot. Taxes tripled over the course of the war, and nobles blamed the king's chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, for raising taxes with calling a States General, which was the law. The only way you could raise taxes was to call the States General, because nobility were the only ones who paid taxes, because they're the only ones who owned land. But you had to get the nobles to agree to the taxes before you could raise the taxes. Oops. Intendants, officials who traveled across France to make sure taxes were being collected and to make sure that nobles were doing what they were supposed to. So after the war, there was a civil war in France known as the Fronde. This was named after the Frondeurs, those who would sling mud at official carriages. This was the France that Louis XIV grew up in. So he grew up in a France consumed by civil war, distrustful of the nobles, and really distrustful of basically everybody. He grew up to be basically just constantly paranoid. Now, while Louis XIV was king, he made New France, which is to say Canada, a province of France proper, gained islands in the Caribbean, outposts in India, built Versailles, which used the most modern techniques at the time. And by 1682, it was the official seat of power in France. Technically, Paris was the capital, but if you wanted to get anything done, you had to go to the king's house. What technically wasn't even his house. It was his hunting lodge. But that's where he spent all his time. If you wanted to talk to the king, you had to go to Versailles, which was like a day's trip by horseback. So yeah, you had to go to the king. You didn't meet with the king in Paris. Dang it, keep forgetting. So there's the Fronde. Dudes just like shooting each other. And this was when I say slinging mud at the carriages, it was typically like with slingshots, often with rocks as well. And not just rocks, but also rotten fruit. And my professor used this image, so I figured I'd use it as well. And there is Versailles today. It's a lot more built up than it was back then. And back then it was a lot more woods back here. There's my mouse. There's a lot more built up than it was back then. All this was how it is now. But it was basically a nature reserve because the king liked to hunt. Here's the Hall of Mirrors, where so many treaties were signed. Let's talk about Louis real quick. Attacked the Spanish Netherlands to push Spain back from the French border. Wars with Spain, Sweden, England, Dutch Republic. Razed and plundered villages. So everybody hated France at this point. The Netherlands and German states hated the French. The French took Alsace and Lorraine from Germany. If you're at all familiar with the World Wars, you may recognize these provinces. If not, we're going to talk about them again. Keep that in mind. War of Spanish Succession. Oh, hey, this was when I mentioned Charles of Spain dying. This is when Charles of Spain got his idiot self killed in a jousting accident. Because, well, he's a noble, and nobles are supposed to do stuff like that. Well, he died by mistake. And the War of Spanish Succession happened. So he didn't have a kid, and apparently the next person in line was a Bourbon prince, which meant that the crown was no longer linked to the Holy Roman Empire, it was linked to France. So there was this concern that France and Spain would now link crowns. Now, while this prince, Philip V, renounced the right to the French throne, Louis XIV was trying to basically create a super country between Spain and France. Austria, England, and the Dutch basically went to war with France over this. Resulted in 3 treaties: Utrecht, Rastatt, and Baden. Allowed the Bourbon prince on the Spanish throne, but forbade the joining of the crowns. It was a completely unnecessary war. It was a whole lot of bloodshed, completely unnecessary, but it was because Louis XIV was very greedy. Austrians got Spanish possessions in Italy and the Netherlands. England got Gibraltar and Minorca. England is very happy about this one. Alsace and Lorraine. Let me do this one real quick. So, Louis XIV was in power so long that Louis XV is his great-grandson. And he came into power to substantial debt, substantial corruption, sold offices to people he liked, spent lots of money on himself, got money by taxing people. The 7 Years' War, which we'll talk about in greater detail later, resulted in France losing most of their overseas possession, including Canada. And while Louis XV liked to spend money like his great-grandfather, he didn't like going to war like his great-grandfather, so he didn't make money like his great-grandfather. So he just ended up pissing everybody off and running France into the red. And this is where we'll leave it, because after this is Austria. So we'll continue on Wednesday with where the rest of Europe is going. But yeah, this is leading towards the French Revolution. We've still got several chapters before we get there. But this is a direct line into that. So yeah, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.